The four-star general stood outside my apartment door in full winter sunlight, his white hair glowing like silver fire beneath the brim of his Marine Corps cap. At first I honestly thought he had the wrong address. Men like him didn't show up at places like mine. Not at a tired apartment complex outside Camp Lejeune where the paint peeled off the railings and the elevator smelled like cigarette smoke and bleach. But then he looked directly at me and saluted. Not casually, not politely, formally. The kind of salute Marines remember for the rest of their lives. My neighbors stopped talking. An elderly woman carrying groceries froze halfway to her door. The general lowered his hand slowly and asked in a quiet voice, "Staff Sergeant Claire Bennett?" "Yes, sir." His eyes drifted toward the small wooden box in my hand. "The watch," he said softly. "Have you opened the back yet?" And suddenly, for the first time since my father died, I realized that maybe my grandfather's broken watch wasn't worthless after all. 3 days earlier, I'd stood beside my father's grave under a gray Charleston sky, while cold rain soaked through the shoulders of my dress blues. My brother Daniel never stopped checking his phone during the funeral. My sister Rebecca cried loudly whenever people were watching, then instantly stopped whenever they turned away. I stood quietly between them, listening to the minister talk about legacy and family and honor while mud gathered around our shoes. The funny thing about funerals is how quickly people reveal who they really are once the coffin disappears underground. By the time we arrived at the lawyer's office afterward, Daniel was already asking about paperwork. Rebecca wanted to know whether the company transfer had been finalized. Nobody asked whether I'd eaten. Nobody asked how I was holding up. That part wasn't unusual. I'd been invisible in my family for most of my life. The lawyer's office overlooked the Charleston harbor. Expensive boats drifted across the water while old ceiling fans hummed above us. Mr. Whitmore, my father's attorney, looked exhausted. He was probably in his late 70s, thin as driftwood with tired eyes behind thick glasses. "I'll make this brief," he said carefully. Daniel leaned forward immediately. Rebecca crossed her legs and adjusted her pearl bracelet. And me, I just sat there trying not to think about the last thing my father ever said to me. "Thank you for coming, Claire. Not I love you. Not I'm proud of you. Just thank you for coming." Mr. Whitmore opened the folder. To Daniel Bennett he said, "Your father leaves the Charleston family estate, including all adjoining property." Daniel smiled before the sentence even finished. To Rebecca Bennett Lawson, "Your father leaves controlling operational ownership of Bennett Coastal Logistics." Rebecca let out a shaky breath of relief. Then came me. The lawyer hesitated. Something in his face changed. To Claire Bennett. Daniel smirked already. "Your father requested that you receive this item personally." Mr. Whitmore reached beneath the desk and lifted out a tiny wooden box. I remember blinking, confused. That was it. He handed it to me gently. Inside sat my grandfather Walter Bennett's old military watch. Scratched crystal, cracked leather strap, dead. The thing probably hadn't worked since Ronald Reagan was president. Daniel laughed first. Actually laughed. "You serious?" Rebecca covered her mouth, trying to hide her smile. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Dad really gave her Grandpa's junk drawer watch." Even Mr. Whitmore looked uncomfortable. I stared down at the watch silently while heat crawled up my neck. That watch used to belong to my grandfather during Korea. I remembered seeing it when I was little. He wore it every day until arthritis twisted his hands too badly to wind it anymore. Still, a broken watch. That was my inheritance. After everything. After all the nights sleeping in hospital chairs beside Dad, after missing deployments to help him through chemo, after paying medical bills, Daniel and Rebecca pretended not to notice. I closed the box carefully. "Thank you," I said quietly. Daniel snorted. "You don't gotta pretend to be grateful." I looked at him. For a second I almost said everything I'd swallowed for 20 years. About how Dad called me every time he needed help but called Daniel whenever he wanted approval. About Rebecca disappearing whenever caregiving became inconvenient. About being treated like unpaid staff instead of family. But Marines learned something early. Humiliation passes quicker when you refuse to perform it for other people. So I stood up calmly. Mr. Whitmore suddenly cleared his throat. "There is one more thing," he said. We all looked up. "Your father requested that Claire receive the watch directly from me. No mailing, no substitutions." Daniel rolled his eyes. Very dramatic. But the lawyer didn't laugh. He kept staring at me strangely, almost nervously. I didn't understand it then. I would later. That evening I drove back to North Carolina alone through 4 hours of coastal rain. The farther I got from Charleston, the lighter my chest felt. Not because I wasn't grieving, because grief gets complicated when the person who hurt you is also the person you loved most. My apartment looked exactly the way I'd left it. Tiny kitchen. Fold-out couch. Coffee maker older than some Marines in my unit. I placed the watch box on the counter and sat there for a long time in silence. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up. The metal felt cold and heavier than I remembered. On the back were tiny engraved initials. Dababi Korea 19 I ran my thumb across them slowly. My grandfather had been a quiet man, never talked much about the war. But when I joined the Marines, he hugged me harder than anyone else in the family. You carry yourself like somebody worth remembering, he once told me. Nobody had ever said something like that to me before. I opened the watch face again. Still dead. Still worthless. Or so I thought. Frustrated, I tossed it into the kitchen drawer beside takeout menus and spare batteries. Then I poured myself a bourbon and tried to forget the entire humiliating day. 3 mornings later, someone knocked on my apartment door at exactly 7:12 a.m. Not pounded, knocked. Precise, controlled. Military. I opened the door expecting maintenance. Instead, a black government SUV sat parked beside the curb, and standing in front of me was an elderly Marine general wearing 4 stars beneath winter sunlight. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. He studied me carefully. Not my apartment, not my clothes, me. Then he saluted. "Staff Sergeant Bennett," he said. "Yes, sir." His eyes softened slightly. "I served with your grandfather." Every sound in the hallway disappeared. "He asked me to find you someday." The general continued quietly. "If the watch ever came back into your hands." My stomach tightened. The old man glanced past me toward the kitchen, toward the drawer. Then he asked the question that changed my life forever. "Have you opened the back of the watch yet?" I remember staring at the general for several seconds before my brain finally caught up with reality. A 4-star Marine general was standing outside my apartment asking about my grandfather's broken watch like it was a matter of national security. I stepped aside automatically. "Please come in, sir." He entered slowly, carrying himself with the careful stiffness of an old warrior whose body had paid dearly for every medal on his chest. The hallway light caught the silver edges of his service ring. Even retired men like him never really stopped looking military. His eyes swept across my apartment quietly. Not judgmental. Just observant. The coffee mugs in the sink, the stack of VA paperwork on the table, my folded uniforms near the couch. "You live alone?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded once like he already understood more than I'd said. "I'm Raymond Mercer," he told me, "retired commandant." I nearly dropped the coffee mug I was reaching for. Everybody in the Corps knew that name. General Raymond Mercer was practically living history. Korea, Vietnam, decorated twice, the kind of man younger Marines still studied at Quantico. And somehow he had known my grandfather. I opened the kitchen drawer slowly and removed the watch box. General Mercer stared at it with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not nostalgia. Something heavier. Regret, maybe. "You haven't opened the back yet," he said quietly. "No, sir, I didn't know it opened." A faint smile touched his face. "Walter always did enjoy secrets." He held out his hand. "May I?" I passed him the watch carefully. His old fingers moved across the metal with surprising precision until he pressed the edge near the winding dial. A soft click echoed through the kitchen. The back panel popped open. I felt my pulse jump. Hidden inside was a tiny folded strip of yellow paper, no thicker than a cigarette. My grandfather had hidden something inside this watch for over 70 years. General Mercer handed it to me. "You should open it." The paper was brittle with age. Inside, written in faded blue ink, were 3 things: a set of coordinates, a safety deposit box number, and a single handwritten sentence. "For the one who understands service." I looked up slowly. "What is this?" The general removed his cap. For the first time, he suddenly looked very old. "Your grandfather saved my life in Korea," he said. Then he sat down at my tiny kitchen table and changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows, while General Mercer spoke in the calm voice of a man who had spent decades carrying painful memories carefully. "December 1952, he began. North Korea, coldest winter I ever lived through." He stared down at the watch. "I was 19 years old and stupid enough to think war made boys into heroes." I stayed quiet. Older people don't usually want interruption when they finally decide to tell the truth. "Your grandfather was my platoon sergeant," he continued. "Walter Bennett." A faint smile appeared. "Meanest man I ever respected." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. That sounded exactly right. "He kept us alive," Mercer said. "That was his gift. Didn't matter if men liked him. He brought them home." The general explained that during a classified reconnaissance mission near the Chosan Reservoir, their unit walked into an ambush. Several Marines died immediately. Mercer himself took shrapnel in his leg. Enemy soldiers closed in fast. He could have left me, the general admitted quietly. Nobody would have blamed him. But Walter Bennett carried him across nearly 2 miles of frozen terrain under enemy fire. By the time rescue arrived, my grandfather had severe frostbite in both hands. Permanent damage. That was why his fingers shook when I knew him. I swallowed hard. Nobody in my family had ever told me any of this. General Mercer looked directly at me. Your grandfather never talked about it because the mission remained classified for years. By the time records cleared, he didn't care about medals anymore. What about my father, I asked. Did he know? Mercer hesitated. Yes. Something tightened inside my chest. All these years. Yes. I leaned back slowly, trying to absorb the strange ache building in my stomach. My father knew his own father had saved a future commandant of the Marine Corps, and he never told me. Never told anyone. Why? Almost as if reading my thoughts, Mercer answered carefully. Your father admired Walter deeply. But I think he also spent his life feeling smaller than him. That landed harder than I expected. Because suddenly my father made more sense. The obsession with status, money, control, always proving himself. Like a man trying to outrun a shadow. Mercer nodded toward the paper in my hand. Your grandfather created that deposit box decades ago. He told me only one of his grandchildren would ever deserve to open it. I almost laughed. Definitely not my brother. The general smiled faintly. No, I suspect Walter figured that out early. 2 hours later, we drove to a small veterans-owned bank outside Jacksonville. The building looked ordinary. Brick walls, American flag, coffee station near the entrance. But the elderly manager nearly fainted when he saw General Mercer walk inside. Sir, he whispered. Mercer simply nodded toward me. She's the Bennett. The manager's entire expression changed. Like he'd been waiting years for this moment. He escorted us into a private vault room downstairs. My hands shook slightly while I entered the box number from the paper. The metal drawer slid open with a soft mechanical sound. Inside sat several sealed envelopes. Military documents, old photographs, and stock certificates. A lot of stock certificates. I frowned. What is this? Mercer picked one up. Your grandfather quietly bought company shares for decades. I stared at him. Bennett Coastal Logistics. Yes. My heartbeat slowed into something cold and careful. How much? The general handed me the papers silently. I scanned the numbers twice because my brain refused to accept them. 51% controlling ownership. I looked up sharply. That's impossible. No, Mercer said softly. It's intentional. I suddenly understood why my father never changed the will before he died. Because legally, he never fully controlled the company in the first place. My grandfather did. And now I did. I sat down heavily in the small leather chair nearby. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then I noticed one final envelope resting beneath the others. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. Claire. My throat tightened instantly. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short handwritten letter. No greeting. No explanation. Just one sentence. If your family forgot what honor means, remind them. I read it 3 times silently. Then I looked at General Mercer. What exactly did my grandfather expect me to do with all this? The old general leaned back slowly. Rain rattled faintly against the vault ceiling above us. And then he gave me an answer that would change the course of my life. That, he said quietly, depends on whether you want revenge or justice. I didn't answer General Mercer right away. Because the truth was, I didn't know. Revenge and justice can feel almost identical when you've spent years swallowing humiliation one polite smile at a time, especially when it comes from your own family. The rain had stopped by the time we left the bank, but the sky over Jacksonville still looked heavy and gray. General Mercer drove slowly through town, while I sat beside him clutching the envelope from my grandfather like it might disappear if I loosened my grip. 51% ownership. The number still didn't feel real. Neither did the fact that my entire family had laughed at me 3 days earlier. I stared out the passenger window quietly. You knew all this before the funeral? I finally asked. Mercer nodded once. Walter contacted me 6 months before he passed. And my father, he knew parts of it. Parts. The general exhaled slowly. Your father knew Walter still held significant shares in the company, but he never believed Walter would transfer control outside the direct inheritance structure. I frowned. Meaning, he assumed Daniel would eventually receive everything. That sounded exactly like my father. Not because he hated me, at least not entirely, but because Daniel fit the picture he wanted the world to see. Successful son, expensive suits, country club memberships, perfect Charleston businessman. Meanwhile, I was 38 years old, divorced, living near a military base in a second-floor apartment with a leaking bathroom faucet. Not exactly the Bennett family success story. Mercer glanced at me carefully. You remind me of your grandfather. I gave a tired smile. That's probably the nicest thing anybody's said to me all week. No, he said quietly. I mean the dangerous part. I looked over. Walter had a habit of enduring disrespect for very long periods of time. Then one day people realized they had misunderstood him completely. That stayed with me, because deep down I knew exactly what he meant. The first call came the next morning. Daniel. I stared at the phone vibrating on my kitchen counter before answering. What? You want to explain why corporate attorneys are calling me at 7 in the damn morning? Straight to anger. No, hello. No, how are you doing after Dad died? Just outrage. I sipped coffee calmly. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't play stupid, Claire. His breathing sounded sharp and fast. They're saying there are controlling shares under your name. I stayed silent. That silence told him everything. Oh my God, he muttered. You actually knew. Knew what? That old man planned this. Old man, not Grandpa. Interesting. Daniel lowered his voice. How much do you have? Enough. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. He exploded. You manipulated Dad while he was dying. I actually laughed then. Not loudly. Just once, a tired laugh from someplace deep in my chest. Manipulated him, I repeated softly. Daniel. I was the one cleaning his vomit at 3 in the morning while you were golfing. Silence. Then, you always do this. Do what? Act morally superior because you joined the Marines. That one stung more than I expected. Because he genuinely believed it. In his mind, my service wasn't sacrifice. It was judgment against him. I never wanted superiority, I said quietly. I wanted respect. Daniel went silent for several seconds. Then he asked the question I think had terrified him since childhood. What are you gonna do now? I looked at my grandfather's watch sitting beside the coffee maker. Still broken. Still stopped at the exact same time. I haven't decided yet. Then I hung up. By afternoon, Rebecca called crying. Real tears this time. Not the polished social tears from the funeral. Claire, she whispered, please tell me you're not trying to destroy us. I closed my eyes. Destroy us. Funny choice of words. As if I hadn't spent years being slowly destroyed myself. I'm not trying to destroy anyone, I told her. Then why didn't you say something? Because I found out yesterday. She sounded genuinely shaken. There are rumors all over the company already. What kind of rumors? That Dad hid ownership structures. That the company finances are unstable. Investors are asking questions. That caught my attention immediately. Unstable how? Rebecca hesitated too long, and suddenly every Marine instinct inside me woke up. What's Daniel hiding? No one's hiding anything. Rebecca. Another silence. Then finally, he borrowed against future shipping contracts last year. How much? A lot. My stomach tightened. How much? Her voice cracked. Almost 40 million. I sat down slowly. $40 million. Jesus Christ. What did he do with it? I don't know all of it, she whispered. Expansion projects, real estate, debt restructuring. Translation. Daniel gambled with the company like a man trying to impress people richer than himself. And now the company was bleeding. How bad is it? I asked quietly. If creditors panic, we could lose everything. Everything. Not just money. Employees, retirement accounts, families, dock workers, drivers, people who'd spent their lives building that company. I rubbed my forehead slowly. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was responsibility. And somehow that felt heavier. Later that evening, General Mercer invited me to dinner at a quiet seafood place near the water. Mostly older couples filled the restaurant. Veterans, retirees, people speaking softly beneath warm yellow lights. Mercer cut into his trout carefully. You look troubled. Daniel buried the company in debt. The general nodded like he'd expected it. Men who inherit too much often confuse confidence with wisdom. I stared at my untouched food. I wanted to hate them, I admitted quietly. That's understandable. But now innocent people are involved. I nodded slowly. The waitress refilled our tea glasses while silence settled between us. Finally, Mercer leaned back. Claire, do you know why your grandfather chose you? Because I served? No. The answer surprised me. Because you understand duty after the applause disappears. I looked at him carefully. Your brother loves power. Your sister loves comfort. But you... He tapped the table lightly. You stay when things become painful. For some reason that nearly broke me. Because all my life staying had felt like failure. Staying to care for Dad. Staying loyal during my marriage while my husband drifted away. Staying in difficult assignments other Marines avoided. But maybe staying mattered. Maybe somebody had noticed. Mercer reached into his coat pocket and slid a newspaper clipping across the table. I frowned. It was an article draft. Headline: Forgotten Korean War Hero Saved Future Marine Commandant. Below it sat an old photograph of my grandfather beside a much younger Raymond Mercer. I looked up slowly. You're releasing this? Yes. Why now? The general's expression turned hard in a way that reminded me he had once commanded entire wars. Because your family built their reputation on money, he said quietly. Then he looked directly into my eyes, and it's time they remembered whose blood built it first. The article hit 3 days later. By breakfast, my grandfather's photograph was everywhere. Local papers, veterans' newsletters, Marine Corps forums online. Even Charleston television stations picked it up. Forgotten Korean War Hero Saved Future Commandant During Classified Mission. I must have read the headline 20 times that morning sitting at my kitchen counter with cold coffee in my hands. There he was. Walter Bennett. My grandfather, a man who spent the last years of his life quietly feeding birds from a porch swing, while arthritis twisted his fingers crooked. And suddenly the entire state was calling him a hero. Funny how quickly the world changes once somebody important confirms your worth. My phone rang nonstop. Reporters, extended relatives I hadn't heard from in years, old Marines. One retired sergeant from Ohio cried while thanking me for my grandfather's service. Meanwhile, Daniel left me 6 voicemails in under 2 hours. None of them pleasant. The last one was simple. You need to get down here now. The Bennett Coastal Logistics headquarters stood near the Charleston port in a polished glass building my grandfather probably would have hated. Too shiny. Too expensive. Too proud of itself. When I walked into the lobby wearing civilian clothes and carrying Grandpa's watch in my jacket pocket, conversations stopped immediately. People stared. Some recognized me from the article. Others probably recognized the Bennett eyes. The receptionist stood quickly. Ms. Bennett, they're waiting upstairs. No smile. No warmth. Tension hung over the whole building like smoke before a fire. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. When the doors opened on the executive floor, I found Daniel pacing outside the conference room, while Rebecca sat pale and exhausted beside the window. Neither looked happy to see me. Daniel pointed toward the room instantly. You went public. I stayed calm. I didn't leak anything. That general did. He told the truth. Daniel laughed bitterly. Truth? He spread his arms wide. The company's stock dropped 9% this morning because investors think the family's imploding. I stared at him carefully. No, Daniel. Investors think the company's unstable because apparently you borrowed $40 million without telling the board. Rebecca closed her eyes. Daniel froze. And just like that, I knew the number was even worse than she'd admitted. How much, I asked quietly. He looked away. How much? 58? My stomach dropped. $58 million? Sweet God. What the hell were you thinking? I was expanding. You were gambling. His face turned red. You think you understand business because Grandpa handed you some paperwork. No, I said calmly. I understand consequences because I've lived with them my entire adult life. That landed harder than shouting would have. Rebecca stood slowly. Can we please stop doing this in the hallway? Inside the conference room, company attorneys and board members sat around the long polished table looking like people trapped inside a hurricane shelter. Nobody smiled when I entered. One older board member stood awkwardly. Ms. Bennett. Interesting. Not Claire. Not Kiddo. Not Daniel's little sister. Suddenly I was Ms. Bennett. Amazing what majority ownership does to people's manners. The company attorney adjusted his glasses nervously. We've confirmed the transfer documents are legally binding. Daniel slammed both hands on the table. This is insane. No, said another board member quietly. What's insane is discovering half the company debt wasn't disclosed properly. The room turned toward Daniel again. Sweat glistened near his collar now. For the first time since childhood, my older brother looked scared. Not angry. Scared. And honestly, part of me enjoyed it. That's the ugly thing nobody tells you about family betrayal. When justice finally arrives, it rarely feels noble at first. It feels satisfying. The emergency meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. I learned more about the company that afternoon than my father had told me in 38 years. Shipping contracts, port negotiations, insurance exposure, debt structures, and buried beneath all of it, Daniel's desperation. He'd been trying to transform Bennett Coastal Logistics into something bigger and flashier for years. Luxury offices? Aggressive expansions? Risky investments? He wanted the company mentioned alongside billion-dollar corporations. But old family businesses aren't built on ego. They're built on survival. My grandfather understood that. Daniel didn't. At one point, he finally snapped. You always thought you were better than us. The room went silent. I looked at him carefully. When What? When did I act better than you? You walk around like some martyr. I almost answered angrily. Instead, I took a breath. I spent 2 years driving back and forth to Charleston every weekend while Dad was sick. Nobody moved. I cleaned him after accidents. I sat through chemo. I handled his medications because he kept forgetting them. My voice stayed calm somehow. Where were you? Daniel stared at the table. Rebecca wiped tears quietly, and suddenly decades of family pretending cracked open right there in that conference room. My sister whispered first. I couldn't handle seeing him like that. I nodded slowly. At least that was honest. But Daniel just shook his head bitterly. He never needed me the way he needed you. That one surprised me. I looked at him. For a second, he didn't look like a wealthy executive. He looked like an exhausted little boy. You were always his favorite, he muttered. I actually blinked. Favorite. Me? The child he barely praised. The daughter he handed a broken watch. But then I remembered something General Mercer said. Your father spent his life feeling smaller than Walter. Maybe Daniel inherited the same sickness, always competing against ghosts. By evening, the board members stepped outside to consult privately with attorneys. Only the 3 of us remained in the room. The Charleston harbor glowed orange beneath sunset outside the windows. Rebecca spoke softly. What happens now? I looked at both of them carefully. Truthfully, I didn't know. I had enough power now to destroy Daniel publicly. The financial misconduct alone could trigger investigations. Prison, maybe? Humiliation. Ruined reputation. Part of me wanted it. After all the years of disrespect, didn't he deserve it? But then another thought appeared. What about the employees? The dock workers nearing retirement. The office staff with mortgages. Families depending on this company surviving. Revenge spreads damage wider than people expect. I rubbed my forehead slowly. General Mercer's words echoed again. Justice and revenge stop looking different after a while. The conference room door opened. The lead attorney stepped back inside. His expression was careful. The board is requesting immediate leadership restructuring. Daniel stood sharply. You can't remove me. The attorney swallowed. Then he looked directly at me. Actually, Ms. Bennett can. Every eye in the room turned toward me. And in that moment I realized my grandfather hadn't just handed me power. He'd handed me a choice about the kind of person I wanted to become. I didn't remove Daniel that night. Not immediately. Which surprised everybody in the room, including him. The attorneys clearly expected a dramatic public execution. Corporate people enjoy blood almost as much as politicians do. Instead, I asked for 48 hours. Just 2 days. Enough time to review every financial document myself. Enough time to decide whether I was acting out of responsibility or anger. Daniel looked suspicious walking out of the building beside me afterward, like a man waiting for the trap to spring. Charleston air hung thick and warm despite the late hour. Harbor lights shimmered across the water while tourists wandered nearby laughing beneath restaurant patios. Normal life. Funny how ordinary the world stays while families quietly collapse behind closed doors. Rebecca hugged herself beside the curb. I don't recognize us anymore, she whispered. I looked at her tired face carefully. The expensive makeup, the strained eyes, the fear underneath all of it. Truthfully, none of us looked like ourselves anymore. Maybe grief had finally stripped away the performance, or maybe we'd been pretending our entire lives. Back at my hotel that night, I couldn't sleep. I spread company records across the bed while old air conditioning rattled against the window. Numbers, debt schedules, port agreements, employee pension obligations. The deeper I dug, the more complicated Daniel's mess became. But something else slowly emerged too. He hadn't stolen money, hadn't hidden offshore accounts, hadn't secretly bought yachts or mansions. Most of the debt came from desperate attempts to keep the company competitive against giant national shipping corporations, swallowing smaller family businesses every year. Bad decisions. Absolutely. Criminal greed. Not exactly. That mattered to me. At around midnight, somebody knocked softly at my hotel door. Rebecca. She held 2 coffees and looked exhausted. Couldn't sleep either, I asked. She gave a weak smile. You remember when Dad used to bring us here for shrimp festivals? I did. Back before money poisoned everything. Before success became the only language our family spoke. She sat carefully near the foot of the bed while I continued reviewing paperwork. Finally, she asked the question quietly. Are you going to ruin him? Straight to it. No pretending. I leaned back slowly. I don't know. Rebecca stared down into her coffee. You know what the worst part is? What? I think Daniel honestly believed he was saving the company. That hit harder than I expected, because I knew she was probably right. People destroy things chasing approval all the time, especially from dead fathers. The next morning I drove alone to my father's grave. Fresh flowers rested near the headstone from someone else's visit. Probably Rebecca. The cemetery sat quiet beneath giant oak trees dripping Spanish moss. I stood there for a long time without speaking. Eventually I crouched and brushed dirt from the base of the stone. Thomas Bennett, beloved father. Strange how gravestones simplify people. They never mention mistakes or silence or emotional wounds passed down across generations. I pulled my grandfather's watch from my pocket. Still frozen. Still stopped. Why me? I asked aloud. Not to Dad. To Grandpa. Because somewhere beneath all this, I still couldn't understand why he trusted me with something this heavy. The wind shifted softly through the trees, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to admit something painful. I hadn't wanted my father's money. Not really. I wanted what every child wants. To feel chosen. Important. Loved openly. But some parents are too damaged to give those things properly. That realization didn't erase the hurt. It just made it sadder. That afternoon I made my decision. The emergency board meeting reconvened at 3 o'clock. This time when I entered the room, nobody looked at me like an outsider anymore. The chair at the head of the table sat empty, waiting. Daniel looked pale. Rebecca looked terrified. The board members looked hungry. I remained standing. I've reviewed the financial exposure. I began calmly. The company can survive if immediate restructuring begins. Relief flickered briefly across several faces. Then I continued. Effective immediately, Daniel Bennett is removed as CEO. Daniel shut his eyes, not shocked, just defeated. But before anyone could celebrate, I added, he will not be publicly accused of fraud. That surprised everybody, especially the attorneys. I looked directly at Daniel. You made reckless decisions. You buried this company in debt trying to prove something to people who were never going to clap for you long enough. I paused. But you were trying to save the business, not rob it. Daniel stared at me silently. I continued. The debt will be restructured. Expansion projects frozen, executive bonuses suspended. One board member frowned immediately. Suspended for how long? Until employee pensions are fully stabilized. That room got very quiet, because wealthy executives don't like hearing the word pensions unless they're campaigning for office. I kept going. No layoffs for dock workers or drivers. Executive salaries reduced first. Now several board members looked openly irritated. Good. My grandfather would have enjoyed that part. Then I delivered the final piece. Daniel and Rebecca will remain with the company. Daniel blinked. What? You'll work salaried operational positions under oversight. His face flushed instantly. You're demoting me. Yes. Humiliation flickered through his eyes. For a second I saw the old version of myself reflected there. The overlooked child. The one never taken seriously. But unlike him, I wasn't doing this to cause pain. I was doing it because consequences matter. Rebecca spoke softly. Why are you helping us? The honest answer came out before I could filter it. Because Grandpa gave me responsibility, not permission to become cruel. Nobody spoke after that. That evening I met General Mercer outside the marina. He listened quietly while I explained everything. Finally he nodded once. Walter would approve. I still feel angry, I admitted. You should. I wanted them to hurt. Mercer smiled sadly. Claire, forgiveness isn't pretending pain never happened. He looked out across the water. It's refusing to hand your pain to the next generation. We stood there in silence a while. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed me one final envelope. Old. Yellowed. My father's handwriting across the front. For Claire. My chest tightened instantly. I found it among Walter's papers, Mercer said softly. I think your father never found the courage to give it to you himself. I stared at the envelope in my trembling hands. And suddenly, after all the fighting, after all the anger, I realized the one thing I still wanted most was not revenge. It was the truth. I waited almost an hour before opening my father's letter. Not because I wasn't curious, because part of me was afraid no words inside could possibly heal 38 years of silence. That night I sat alone on the balcony outside my hotel room while Charleston harbor lights shimmered softly beneath the dark sky. The envelope trembled slightly in my hands. For Claire. Just seeing my name written by him felt strangely personal. My father had never been a man comfortable with emotion. He communicated through instructions. Bills paid. Practical advice. Quiet gestures. Love in our family usually arrived disguised as responsibility. I finally unfolded the letter. And for the first time since childhood, I cried because of my father instead of in spite of him. Claire, if you're reading this, then I probably waited too long again. That was my talent as a father. Waiting too long. There are things I should have said years ago. The first is that I know I hurt you. More than once. More than I admitted. When you were young, I thought strength came from preparing children for disappointment. My own father raised me that way after Korea. I mistook emotional distance for discipline. But you were different from me. Different from all of us. You stayed when things became difficult. I saw it every time you drove back from North Carolina to help me after chemo treatments. I saw it when you slept in hospital chairs. I saw it when you thought nobody noticed. The truth is, I depended on you because you were the only one I trusted not to leave. That wasn't fair to you, and I think somewhere along the way I punished you for being the strongest person in the family. My vision blurred reading that line. I stopped for a moment, wiping my eyes carefully, then continued. Daniel always needed approval. Rebecca always needed protection. But you only needed honesty. And unfortunately, honesty was the one thing I struggled to give. Your grandfather understood something I didn't until too late. Character matters more than image. I spent my life protecting the appearance of success while quietly leaning on the child I praised the least. For that, I am sorry. More than you know, there was more, much more. Stories about my grandfather, about the company's early years, about how terrified my father had been of losing everything his own father built after the war. Suddenly, the Bennett family finally made sense to me. Fear. Everything came back to fear. Fear of failure. Fear of appearing weak. Fear of not measuring up to Walter Bennett. Even love in our family had become tangled in performance. Near the end of the letter, my father wrote something that nearly broke me completely. You became the best of all of us, Claire. And I think part of me resented you for it. Not because you made me feel small. Because you reminded me of the man I wished I'd been. I lowered the paper slowly and cried harder than I had at his funeral. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet grief. The kind older people understand. The kind that comes when anger finally runs out and only sadness remains. A year later, Bennett Coastal Logistics barely resembled the company my father left behind. We survived. That still amazes me sometimes. The first 6 months were brutal. Debt restructuring, contract renegotiations, selling unnecessary corporate properties, executive pay cuts. A few board members resigned after discovering I cared more about pensions than private dining rooms. Good riddance. The strange part, employees started trusting leadership again. Dock workers who hadn't smiled in years suddenly stopped me in hallways to talk. Drivers sent handwritten thank you cards after we restored retirement protections. One older mechanic shook my hand so hard I thought he might break it. Your granddaddy would be proud, he told me. That mattered more than any corporate award ever could. Daniel changed too, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. Losing the CEO title shattered something inside him at first. For months he barely spoke during meetings. Then one afternoon I walked past the loading docks and saw him helping workers unload supplies in 100-degree heat without cameras nearby. No performance, no audience, just work. When he noticed me watching, he looked embarrassed. I forgot what this company actually does, he admitted quietly. That may have been the most honest sentence my brother ever spoke. Rebecca transformed in different ways. She started volunteering with military widow support programs through one of our new company charities. Not for publicity. Most people never even knew. One evening she confessed something while we ate dinner together. I used to think kindness was something weak people leaned on, she said softly. And now, she smiled sadly, now I think it's probably the hardest thing anybody can do. General Mercer passed away 11 months after my father. Peacefully, in his sleep. 93 years old. I attended the funeral in dress blues beside rows of aging Marines standing painfully straight, despite canes and artificial knees. Before taps played, an officer handed me a small package Mercer requested I receive after his death. Inside sat my grandfather's repaired watch, fully restored, ticking softly. Alongside it was a note in Mercer's careful handwriting. Some things only work again after time and pressure. I wear that watch every day now, not because it's valuable, because it reminds me what inheritance really means. Not money, not property, not power. Responsibility, grace, truth. Last month our family gathered for dinner at Rebecca's house. Nothing fancy. Pot roast, cornbread, sweet tea. Daniel complained about his back hurting after warehouse inspections. Rebecca laughed too loudly at one of my terrible Marine jokes. And for the first time in decades, nobody was pretending to be more important than they were. Halfway through dessert, Daniel looked at me quietly. You know, he said, I used to think Grandpa gave you that watch because he loved you more. I smiled faintly. What do you think now? He looked down at his plate for a moment. I think he gave it to you because he trusted you more. That difference meant everything. A few weeks later, I stood at a military memorial ceremony while my grandfather's long-overdue commendation was read publicly before a crowd of veterans and families. As applause echoed across the ceremony grounds, I touched the watch on my wrist gently. Then I looked toward the empty seat reserved for General Mercer, and silently thanked both old Marines for teaching me something my family spent generations forgetting. Strength without humility destroys people, but strength with compassion can rebuild them. So, if you're listening to this story tonight while thinking about your own family, maybe your own old wounds, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what somebody leaves behind. It's the chance to become better than the pain they handed you. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who still believes families can heal. And maybe subscribe for more stories about ordinary people finding dignity, courage, and peace in difficult places.